to change the lights to make them so much brighter. Oh, that's bright. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Back this up a little bit. As people are coming in, I will just say a few things briefly. As the first speaker, I guess I get that honor. So the symposium that is about to happen here is a symposium that has been supported by the Jacobs Foundation. For those of you who don't know, the Jacobs Foundation is a foundation that supports and really cares about early childhood well-being, including having a program looking at the science of learning. And they have great network for early career faculty as well as mid-career faculty. So the talks that you're going to hear today are from faculty that are all part of this early career network cohort. And we're just absolutely delighted to be here. Cognitive Science Conference is actually a conference that I never miss unless I'm having children exactly the week of it. And so I think I've been here 15 years at least. But for some of our speakers today, it's a conference they haven't come to as often. So I think we're going to get a really interestingly diverse group of speakers today. Okay, so without further ado, I will launch in. Can everyone hear me in the back? Can you guys hear me? All right, great echo. All right, so my name is Elizabeth Bonowitz, and when I was asked for the title of my talk a few months ago, apparently what I emailed was still curious about curiosity, what developmental psychology might teach us. So I'll maybe sort of talk about that. Again, mostly what I think I'm going to focus on today are a couple of different aspects. First, I want to talk about a few aspects of curiosity. I'll say a little bit about why exploration, which is a common approach to measuring curiosity in children and non-human animals, why it actually might pose some problems for our scientific interpretation of whether we're actually getting at curiosity. Then I'll provide a little background on the cognitive accounts of curiosity. And finally, I'm going to provide three novel-ish proposals about curiosity with ways to investigate these proposals in early childhood. So let's start, as we often like to, with some historical figures. Cicero referred to curiosity as an innate love of learning and of knowledge without the lure of any profit. He went on to define it as a passion for learning And similarly, Kant defined it as an appetite for knowledge. In the 1950s, Berlin further refined our definitions of curiosity, characterizing dimensions by which we might be able to understand it. So one dimension he deemed sensory or perceptual, and at the other end of the spectrum from this was the cognitive. So sensory curiosity tends towards novel sensations and stimuli, while cognitive has to do with sort of desire for knowledge, higher level kinds of thinking. Another axis involved diversive curiosity, so having a generalized experience that seeks any and varied sources of novelty and challenge. And on the opposite side of diversive is specific, so desiring depth for a single specific stimulus or activity. And along these quadrants, you're going to find different kinds of exploratory behavior. So a bored teenager clicking through recommended YouTube channels might be experiencing diversive and cognitive curiosity. A rat exploring some novel paths in a maze, Berlin equated to diversive and sensory. What I personally tend to be interested in is the combination of cognitive and specific factors of curiosity. So why we're motivated to revise our intuitive and scientific beliefs of the world, which is that upper left quadrant. So how might we measure curiosity? Well, as an internal state, it's actually quite difficult to measure. It's a cognitive itch that somehow we need to quantify. So to understand this itch of curiosity, one might measure the scratch, exploration. So indeed, as it can be ascertained from Berlin's examples on the previous slide, much research has tended to use exploration as a proxy for curiosity. So there's a good reason for this, of course. If you study non-human animals, or like me, if you study the less housebroken human animals under a certain age, it's difficult to get report measures from participants about their internal experiences of curiosity. And even in adults, self-reports are dubious for myriad reasons. So exploration, and in the case of much of my research, play and active learning, might be reasonably looked at as a reliable methodological tactic. But I think there's several potential challenges with the approach as using exploration as a proxy for curiosity. So first, and returning to Berlin for a minute, consider the dimensions of curiosity. There's, I think, a rise in the field of understanding the diversive versus specific divide in the 1970s and 80s. And at that time, research started to suggest that behaviors that might have fallen on the right side of this scale as curiosity might not actually be particularly related to the kinds of behaviors that fall on the other side. So as it turns out, diversive curiosity actually turns to be a little bit more related to sensation seeking. And even Berlin suggested in published fragments of his book that diversive type probability should not have been categorized as curiosity. So exploration can follow from either diversive or specific motivations, but it's not clear how to measure these, and if these are independent features of curiosity, or if diversive is even curiosity at all, this poses a problem for our interpretation of whether or not certain exploratory behaviors are even reflecting what we would want to call curiosity. Second, let's return to Cicero, who tells us that curiosity is a love of learning and of knowledge. But from here, we can ask which kinds of knowledge and learning count. So, for example, consider a typical novel play task we give children in our experiments. We show children a particular feature of a toy, say that pulling a tube causes a squeak, and then we let the child playfully explore on their own. We measure things like the proportion of time spent on the demonstrated function, the variability of exploration, the amount of time spent with the toy before the child says they want to stop and do something else altogether. And I think what might be forgiven the misdemeanor of stating that the child who explores more variably or who explores longer is more curious. I'm pretty sure I've probably hastily suggested this interpretation in my own work. But let's consider this argument for a moment. Consider the child whose time is spent playing almost entirely with the demonstrated function. So the kid's there for 5 minutes and they are squeaking forever on this toy, right? Are they less curious? Maybe they're less curious about everything else that the toy could do, but maybe they're more curious about exactly how this specific function could work. So that is, we can't reasonably claim that broad variable exploration reflects any greater curiosity than deep exploration of a single thing. So herein lies the second challenge of interpreting exploration as an indicator of curiosity. A third problem is that other kinds of goals also drive exploration. So let's take an exploration paradigm that's adapted for children falling out of the sort of explore-exploit literature. Children can choose to take a known reward, 2 marbles, or they can explore an unknown reward sampled from a distribution that they don't know anything about. We can do this over many trials. 6 is about the upper limit for preschoolers. And we tell children that if they choose the unknown box, they're going to get to see what's inside at the end of the game. This is great. If kids are curious, then they're going to explore. So this is what my talented past lab manager, Liz Lapidow, and I did. And what we found was that children avoided the exploratory choice, showing what is known in the decision-making literature as ambiguity aversion. But Liz's, you say, you made the children wait to find out, and so maybe this is like delay discounting of information. The curiosity isn't getting satiated right away. Maybe that's why they're not bothering exploring. Okay, fair enough. Calm down. We include another trial where children can see the outcome that they sampled right away, but after each trial, we switched which distribution the new unknown box was sampled from. And what we found was that children were still not particularly exploratory. There's no significant differences between these conditions and the condition where there was no feedback, and there's no difference between this condition and chance responding. Okay, you say, but maybe they were curious about the whole distribution and not just the single box, so by switching after each trial, the information learned from any single sample isn't enough to pique curiosity. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. So to test this, we ran a condition where children learned about the uncertain box if they explored it. And for subsequent trials, we kept drawing from the same distribution, so children could learn about how many marbles they could expect in general about the unknown pile. And indeed, in this case, children do explore significantly more than either of the other conditions and more than would be expected by chance. So, aha, you say. When there was more to be learned, children explored more. Curiosity can be measured. But can it? The problem here comes back to Cicero. So he tells us that curiosity is the love of learning without the lure of any profit. And if there's one thing that I've learned from being a developmental psychologist, it's that preschoolers will do almost anything to maximize their chances of getting more marbles. So if they're taking exploratory actions to learn about the world so that it might help future decision making to maximize marble profit, then is it really this lovely intrinsic curiosity that we aspire to measure and to understand? And so this brings us to our 4th challenge. Cicero and Kant tell us that curiosity is a passion or an appetite for information. But our current understanding of what affective states are, let alone how to measure them, is pretty tenuous at this point. And it gets even stickier when we want to link our formal models of uncertainty and exploration to these affective states. This isn't an insurmountable problem, it's just a point to the fact that I don't think we're there yet in our current models. Though I encourage you to check out Todd's, our moderator's, lab poster on Saturday titled Modeling the Dynamics of Suspense, something like that, right? And so I think this is an important first step towards this goal. Okay, so these are just some of the challenges in interpreting exploratory measures in childhood as signals of curiosity. So then rather than focus on a response measure, the scratch that follows the itch, let's see if we can identify some of the inputs or triggers that might stimulate curiosity. And here we're going to turn back to Berlin first. So Berlin also suggested that curiosity is driven by external stimuli such as stimulus conflict or incongruity, as in complex, novel, and surprising situations. Well, Amy Stahl and Lisa Feigenson have completed some really beautiful work with younger children and infants, finding that when infants observe information that's surprising, they explore more. But of course, the interpretation of this result is cognitive, so it's not behaviorist as Berlin's wording might lead to. The argument here precisely is that what makes these events surprising is that they're violations of internal belief states, they're sort of core knowledge principles. And this focus on agents' knowledge as a critical component in curiosity has been noted, of course, by William James, as well as by more contemporary scientists such as George Lowenstein, who's begun to apply more rigorous models of measuring this gap in terms of entropy and information gain. Indeed, turning to my own research, I wanted to investigate the potential role of an individual's knowledge state in driving exploration. So we measured children's beliefs about balance. So this is inspired by Karmoff, Smith, and Inhelder's important findings that children revise their beliefs about balance in the early elementary school years, moving from center theorists to mass theory about how blocks should balance. And critically, we showed children evidence that would be interpreted as surprising only with respect to their theories. So a block balancing at a particular point would be surprising to a mass theorist, but not to a center theorist, and vice versa. And indeed, what we found is that this pattern of exploring depended on both the children's internal beliefs and the evidence that they observed, providing a compelling support, I think, for the cognitivist perspective. But as any rational constructivist might, I think a lot about the important role of evidence in driving theory change, and reciprocally the role of prior theories in our interpretation of evidence. And in particular, causal, explanatory, theory-rich knowledge that's sort of up here rather than up here, I think seems to hold a special lure for us. So consider the opportunity to find out about one of two possible pieces of information. You learn about a character, Bunny, who feels nervous and eats cheese and then gets a stomach ache. Both the cheese and the worrying might be a priori plausible causes to you. Both co-occur with the effect, so you have uncertainty that puts equal weight on both of them being the true cause. All right, so hold that in mind. And now simultaneously, there's another mystery to solve. Bunny wears tight shoes, Bunny runs on the rocks, and Bunny gets a sore foot. So both the tight shoes and the rock running are a priori plausible causes of Bunny's tummy ache. Both co-occur with the effect once, so you have uncertainty that puts equal weight on both being the one true cause. And the question to you is, which mystery do you want to resolve? Do you want to learn about the one true cause of Bunny's tummy ache, or do you want to learn about the one true cause of Bunny's sore foot? So both are balanced in terms of their information gain at the causal model level. The proposal here is that we might be more curious about information that could be explanatorily general, that could help us resolve uncertainty in our broader intuitive theories of the world. And this should hold as long as you have uncertainty in those theories. So if you're developing an intuitive theory of psychosomatic causes, learning about the tummy ache might be more interesting to you because it tells you both about the model level data here, but it also tells you and provides you with compelling information for your intuitive theory of psychosomatic events. Of course, if you have a strong belief in the fact that psychosomatic events exist, and you also happen to get compelling evidence earlier in the story, say that worrying is causing Bunny's tummy ache, the options are no longer balanced for information gain, and so you might not favor the theory-rich domain. So I think such a proposal is optimally investigated in the preschool years. As it turns out, preschool-age children have uncertainty about lots of rich causal models, so they don't fully understand biological contagion until school age. They struggle with some explicit forms of false belief reasoning until at least 4. And prior to school-age, children are also starting to learn that psychosomatic events are possible. Things like being embarrassed can cause you to blush, or being worried can cause a tummy ache. So we designed an experiment to look at this proposal. And our first goal was to measure children's current level of understanding in each knowledge domain using a battery of questions. And then on a separate visit, 1 to 2 weeks later, we came back and children were told stories with 2 pieces of potential information, one that's theory relevant and the other that's domain irrelevant, just like the bunny storybook dilemma that I gave you earlier. And so we gave storybooks like this one that I described in each of the 3 domains to the children. And we analyzed children's choices of what they wanted to learn more about in these storybooks, given this preference, performance on the earlier battery. And so what you're seeing here is the graph of breaking children up by children who perform worse and who have more uncertainty in their early theories that are earlier developing versus children who are more mature in their theories. And the y-axis is going to say, as you move up towards 100, that's choosing the domain that is more theory-rich. It's choosing the storybook that has to do with the domain in question. And what we found is that children with earlier developing theories, the ones that are more uncertain in these domains of knowledge, are also the ones that are choosing to explore those particular domains in the storybook over the factual information about the sore foot, say. But the more mature theory children are not necessarily doing this. And this pattern of data also is significant between groups, as well as the younger children being different from chance. And it holds across all three domains if you break them down individually. Now, one concern you might have is that this has something to do with age differences rather than changes in intuitive theories, but additional analyses showed that these results are not mediated by children's age. So instead, these results suggest that the level of children's intuitive theories is driving their exploration. So these results suggest that curiosity may depend not just on the uncertainty of information in front of you and whether that information closes an immediate knowledge gap at the model level, but also that children are attending to whether or not information might help inform their knowledge or their theories at a higher framework level. So as I've mentioned, a classic way that curiosity has been studied is in surprise responses to events that were unpredicted by our current knowledge. And one way to conceptualize of curiosity is a general cognitive boost that improves learning performance for the surprising event as well as unrelated events that might follow, or at least not be related to following events. But when we consider that working memory is finite in a human learner, and especially in the child, another possibility is that surprising events are dwelt on, or they might cause you to sort of carry out mental search, taxing your working memory. And such dwelling could take away these kinds of memory resources for other kinds of things in the environment. So this brings us to a second proposal about curiosity, and that's that it could drive executive functioning like attention and working memory resources, but at the potential cost when these resources are in conflict with other kinds of learning goals. We have slide failure. All right, I can manually adjust. So this is the question that my graduate student Carla Macias is seeking to understand, whether belief-violating information impacts children's allocation of working memory resources, and does this go beyond the scope of the single event? So to get at this question, what she did was she designed this clever, cool experiment where children observe a magic trick. So they see a ball go under a particular cup, and then unbeknownst to them, the ball is secretly moved to another cup, and then when they're looking for the ball, it's surprising to discover that somehow it's teleported to some other cup. So these are preschool-age children. But then the critical test that Carla had was whether or not that impacts their learning on a subsequent unrelated task. So she gave children an unrelated memory task where they had to learn pairs of associated items. So they saw 3 items like this, and they had to learn that, for example, the 2 on the bottom go together, and they're going to be tested on this memory later. So they're just randomly associated items. And the trick was that in addition to this belief-violating event, we also included belief-consistent events. So a different group of children saw almost an identical show, except the ball didn't violate any principles of ballness. And children also saw a low probability event in which something somewhat surprising happened, but not violating intuitive theories of solidity. So here we have the preliminary pre-registered results for the associative memory task. This is just about 3/4 of the data collected so far. And what our results suggest is that participants in the belief-violating condition have a harder time remembering the object pairs in comparison to participants in the belief-consistent and the low probability condition. So we talk a lot about curiosity boosting learning, but I think this is important to remember that we as finite systems might actually have to have a trade. A gain in one area might potentially lead to a loss in another. And I think these preliminary results furthermore suggest a new avenue for thinking about measuring curiosity, that's well designed for studies with children who may not yet have strategic ways to mentally set aside curiosities in order to focus on new tasks at hand. So, taken together, I think that the role of our developing cognitive representations in curiosity and the impact of curiosity on memory suggests a lightly alternative way to conceptualize curiosity. which is a drive that not only motivates us to explore and inquire, that helps maintain and encode new information, but also one that might prepare us for information so that we know which actions to take, which information to attend, and which representations to incorporate and be incorporated by that information. So we can think of curiosity potentially also as like a sous chef. It's setting the stage, the mise en place for learning. And here will be, I think, the place where I'll disappoint because I don't actually have current data on this final proposal, but what I do have is a suggestion for potential mechanism to investigate it. So specifically, researchers have suggested that theta activation could be related to an expectation of information. And here's just one lovely study that uses this technique to look at infant speaker preferences in a language learning task run by Katarina Begas and colleagues. Most excitedly to me is that Ka has come to work with me, and we're going to start to develop studies that might be able to apply this kind of approach to look at this idea in studying curiosity and expectation of information in even earlier childhood. Okay, so to wrap up, today I tried to talk to you about a couple of ideas pertaining to curiosity. The first is that I think that there are challenges in measuring curiosity by exploration. The second is that I focused on how we need to think about the inputs and the knowledge of the learner. And finally, I provided 3 novel-ish proposals about curiosity and why I think developmental psychology can help inform us. Thank you. So because we're recording these talks, we don't actually have time for questions immediately after each talk, but we'll have time at the very end of the session. That's right. So please save your questions to the end. If you're write it down so that you don't spend your time thinking about what your question is and then not pay attention to the rest of the talks, is the data from my yeah, right? Okay. All right. So our next speaker, I'll let you find.
Okay. Luckily, Liz's talk was so clear, no one has any questions, so you can all pay attention to me. Thanks so much for coming. Apologies for my voice, the aircon is killing me. And thanks so much for the organizers to invite me and for Jacobs for sponsoring this exciting symposium. I'm extremely excited to be here. It's, I have to be honest, my first CogSci, and the program looks amazing, really great people, really great talks that I've seen so far, so it won't be my last time. And I'm also really excited because what I'm going to present to you is brand new data. Some of the plots come hot off the press from my PhD student, and I'm really curious also to see what you think about it. And it's great to talk here in the symposium together with these great colleagues of mine from the Jacobs Foundation, who all going to present in some way or another developmental data. And I thought I'll be the odd one out, and I will not talk about development at all. Instead, I will talk about beer. I have to make a confession, I really like beer, I really like craft beer, and so whenever I come to a new place, like Montreal here, that gives also a great opportunity to explore the local beer market, to go to these lot of little microbreweries and figure out what kind of new beers do they have, and really expand my knowledge about beer. And Montreal is particularly well suited for that. But it also puts me in quite a difficult problem, because if I go to a nice bar like this, there's a load of variety of beers, and how do I choose the beer that I want to drink? I mean, there are like 10, 15 taps, so which beer am I going to take? And you can follow different strategies to explore these new beers. So either you can go for the beer that you know you have had before, you know it's good, it's a safe choice, but you probably don't learn that much new because you know it's probably pretty similar here and in New York. The alternative would be to go for a beer which you've never had. Looks like it's a beer from Quebec and you don't get it anywhere else. So it could be really amazing, you can learn a lot, but maybe it's also like not really good. Or alternatively, you could just like select a beer that you know exists, but you're not really excited about, and you neither learn anything new nor you're really gonna enjoy drinking it. And so whenever I face these problems, the thing that I do and we should all do when we face these existential crises is go and see what does science tell us to do. And so if you go and look at, well, what are the strategies of exploring and solving such a problem and what have clever scientists come up with, then we can see that there are different forms of how we explore different options, not only beers. And one is just take the one that you know and that you think is really good, and you know quite well, which is what we call exploitation. So you just exploit your prior knowledge, you know what is good, and you go for it. An alternative strategy is to actually use your uncertainty about the options that you have. So some beers you might have heard of or some beers you've never heard of, and you can quantify that and use that to guide your choice. And they're usually described two different ways of exploration that use your uncertainty to guide. One is usually called random exploration, which your uncertainty about the option helps you induce a stochasticity in your decision process, whereas the other, their uncertainty acts as epistemic value, as a bonus which you add to how good you think something is. And these are captured by computational models such as Thompson sampling in the stochasticity case and upper confidence bound in the directed exploration, where you have an actual information bonus. But both of these forms of exploration are actually quite demanding in terms of your computation. So if you have several options, you have to have a belief about the utility, about how good you think these beers are, but also how uncertain you are about these beers. And that is quite laborious. And one thing to very easily overcome that is what we call tabula rasa exploration, where you essentially close your eyes and randomly point at one of the tabs. So you kind of discard all of your prior knowledge and just randomly every now and then select any of that with ignoring any prior information you had. And that is built in algorithms such as epsilon greedy. And it can lead, and it's a very efficient way of exploration, but however, every now and then you actually end up at a choice which is not good, which you don't think is good, but because you kind of forget all of your prior knowledge, you still choose it sometimes. And so if we want to know about exploration, we also want to know about, like, how does the brain solve that? And how is that possibly implemented in the brain? And in order to actually guide exploration and information processing in a way that it's effective, what has to be happening in the brain is that you have to have a system which influences information processing on a larger scale in the areas which we know are relevant for decision making, so mainly prefrontal cortex and striatal areas. And two systems which are very well suited for doing that are the neurotransmitters noradrenaline, dopamine, which we know arise from the midbrain, but have projections to, like, all of the important decision-related areas of the brain. And we know that dopamine is very much involved in valuation and assessing the benefit of options, so it could actually be involved in this uncertainty-based or directed in exploration, whereas noradrenaline has often also been described as having the function of a reset button, of kind of overriding prior information and goals, and could therefore contribute to exploration like tabula rasa exploration. And so we wanted to test that and the role of these two neurotransmitter systems, and we did that in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, and this is work that has mainly been done by my PhD student, Magda Dubois. And what we did is we had participants come in and we either gave them a placebo, we gave them propranolol, which blocks the beta receptor of the noradrenaline system, so it decreases the functioning of noradrenaline, or we gave them amylsulprid, which is a dopamine D2, D3 receptor antagonist, so affects the dopamine functioning. And to test these different forms of exploration, we developed a new task, which is based on Bob Wilson's work, where we slightly modified it to better get a handle at these different forms of exploration. And people came, and they were farmers, so they had to harvest apples from different trees, and their goal is to get the biggest apple, to get the biggest harvest every day. And when they came, they saw on the bottom, you see these apples that were already there, so there was another apple picker before them, and so they had some information about some of the trees, and some of the trees were completely unknown to them. And we constructed the task in a way that we had the 4 different types of trees. We had the red trees in this case, the exploitation trees, where people saw already like 3 apples, so they had a pretty good knowledge about how good this tree is going to be, and they're usually rather big, so they're actually good trees. We had another tree which only had 1 apple, and this apple was always significantly slower than the others, which was actually a really bad tree. So if you were rational and would be really guided by what you've already seen, you would hardly ever choose it. However, in a E epsilon greedy tabula rasa kind of exploration, you might sometimes choose it. And then we had 2 more trees. One of them had only 1 apple picked, so had less information than the red exploitation option, whereas the other had no information at all. So if you were to pick that, you would actually learn the most. And we manipulated how beneficial exploration would be by manipulating the horizon. So in half of the trials, they could only pick 1 apple, where exploration actually doesn't benefit you because you cannot build on that knowledge. Whereas in the other, there was a much longer horizon, and there actually exploration was beneficial. So the first thing we could ask is just very broadly, do people actually modulate their way of picking apples depending on the horizon? And what you see here is how big the apple was, the first apple they picked, depending on the horizon. And indeed, what we find is that in the long horizon, where exploration is more beneficial, they actually, on average, choose a smaller apple, which supports the idea, or supports the finding that they explore more. But then often in these exploration tasks, the problem is they don't really benefit from their exploration in the way the tasks are constructed. So we looked at, well, on average, does that actually benefit them? So in the long horizon, do they on average choose the bigger apples overall? And indeed, we find that, so that in the long horizon, although the first apple they pick is smaller, on average, they use that information and choose the bigger apples overall. So they do exploration and it benefits them. So then we move on and can have a look at the behavior, and we can look at how many exploitative choices do they make, and how is that modulated by horizon. So this is the apple which has a lot of information, and it's usually relatively good. And we see that when there is a long horizon, all of the 3 groups show less of exploration, but that is not any different between the different drug conditions. So meaning that all of them modulate their exploration or their exploitation, but the exploitation is not different between the drug groups. But it could still be that like the way of exploring might be different between the groups. And so when we look at this tabula rasa exploration, and as a proxy, we just take the apple, the tree, where they see one but really bad apple, we see that people still pick it, and they do more so in the long horizon, which is actually supports the idea that they use that as an active strategy for exploration. And when we look at the group's differences, we indeed see that the noradrenaline group behaves differently. So if you block noradrenaline, this tabula rasa kind of exploration is reduced compared to the placebo. We can then go on and look at the other kind of uncertainty-based trees, and we see that this is modulated again by horizon, and there is a slight effect on the exploration there, mainly in the amyl sulfurate group. But from like these kind of plots or these behaviors, it's very difficult to tell what is exactly going on and how is that trade-off on which kind of uncertainty-based exploration is affected. So to better understand that, we use computational modeling, and we used a whole series of more than 40 different models to find which kind of model that fits the behavior best. And what we find is that the best model is indeed a model that uses both kinds of uncertainty-based exploration, but also this tabula rasa part of exploration. And the winning model had very good parameter recoverability, which suggests that we can use these parameters to really tease apart this different kind of exploration. And when we look at this at the parameters of our winning model, and we compare it between the groups, then we indeed see, when we look at this lapse rate, this tabula rasa parameter, we indeed see the same effect that we saw in the behavior, that the propranolol group had a lowered parameter in there compared to the placebo. So again, supporting that if you block noradrenaline functioning, you actually show less of this tabula rasa exploration. What we also found is that there is a novelty bonus, which in particular benefits trees which have no information at all. And you see that there is a modulation by horizon, so the novelty bonus gets even bigger if you have a longer horizon. And there is a weak effect, a weak interaction in amyl sulfurate, where you see this contrast between the horizons seems to be a bit more increased compared to placebo, but this is only marginally significant, so I wouldn't bet too much on it. And so to sum up, I hope I was able to show to you that there are different ways to explore, and there are different ways to explore beer market in Montreal, that if you block noradrenaline, that decreases your tabula rasa type of exploration, and there might be some role of dopamine in the role of novelty bonuses in exploration. And with this having said, I would like to thank my funders, especially Jacobs, which funded that work, and my group. Thank you.
Great. I'll adjust that a little bit. Tobias is a little taller than me. Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming at the end of the day. My name is Celeste Kidd. I'm at UC Berkeley. I've been there for just 1 year. And in my lab, we're interested in belief formation in general, especially as it pertains to development. Kids have to go from knowing very little about the world to eventually possessing very sophisticated networks of knowledge about how things in the world work. The problem is there's far more knowledge in the world than anyone could ever possibly obtain, which means that individuals like my Symposium speakers have pointed out, you have to pick and choose. Each moment when a child has selected one thing to learn from, they're necessarily missing out on everything else. So each choice matters because of that opportunity cost. So how do they make those decisions? The honest answer is we're still working through this question. I think this is evident already from the talks we've had so far. Instead, what I'm planning on doing is telling you 4 things in the next 15 minutes that I think that we do know. I'm going to follow that up by 4 things that I think that we don't know yet, but that we should. I'll make some claims, I'll show you some evidence, and I'll look forward to elaborating these points for interested parties in the Q&A at the end of this session, but then also in one-on-ones in the next few days. So the first thing I think that we know is that learners seek out material that's useful for learning. This is something that both Tobias and Liz have made reference to. This is not a novel claim, but it's one for which there was little quantitative evidence until relatively recently. All of these guys thought that learners should and probably did select information that was most useful for learning. They generally define that as meaning that the preferred stimulus should be neither overly redundant with what the learner currently already knows, nor too dissimilar. Too dissimilar, and the learner couldn't gain traction in learning new things. It's hard to learn algebra if you don't yet understand the common meaning of the common mathematical symbols. Thus, the idea was that the learner should select things that are neither overly predictable nor overly surprising. But testing this idea was tricky because defining what's useful for the learner changes depending on the context. You can only compute it in a particular moment for a particular learner and given a particular knowledge state. And the thing about knowledge is it's always changing. And even if you know all of that, a particular learner's current knowledge is usually sort of a black box. You need a way of quantifying that knowledge and computing a learner's expectations based on that knowledge. This is something that we found evidence for in my lab, starting in infancy and continuing through adulthood. We had the advantage of new technologies like eye trackers and probabilistic models. In a series of experiments, we showed 7-month-olds and later older children displays designed to allow us to construct a reasonable probabilistic model of infants' likely expectations, moment to moment as the displays unfold. So in these displays, objects pop out of boxes, and as long as the infant continues to look, the display continues to unfold over time. So moment to moment, an infant is making a decision about whether to continue watching or whether they should cut their losses and look for something else. If they cut their losses and look for something else, it's like they get that attention getter back and they get another series of boxes and displays. So when we do that, we're able to compute infants' look-away behavior, and what we get out is a pattern that looks like this. This is their look-away probability on this axis, and then the model's estimate of how predictable or surprising a particular event is in this sequential display. As you can see, just like many people predicted before us, infants are substantially more likely to look away for events that are very, very predictable given their current expectations, but also they're very likely to look away for events that are very, very surprising given what they're currently expecting. They're least likely to look away, thus more likely to stay engaged with material that's a little bit surprising given their expectations, but not overly surprising. This isn't just true for individual infants, for a population of infants, this is also true within individuals. I just realized I can't really see, I'm too short to see the time, sorry. Okay. So this is true within individual infants as well. Okay. Number 2, what is useful for learning can only be determined in a particular context. For this work, I think this point is best demonstrated by an ideal learner model constructed by a former student of mine who's now at MIT working with Laura Schultz, Maddie Pels. This model involves an ideal learner model setup. There's an ideal learner in it, and a toy world with multiple possible objects that the ideal learner can attend to. And the goal of the learner is to maximize learning in this little toy world. There's 2 components that you need to know about. One is the learning curve. This is represented by a Gompertz function, which is just characterized by a slow start when the learner first starts learning about something, and then the rate of learning ramps up. As the learner approaches everything that they could possibly know about a particular object, then there's a diminishing return towards the end. And then the second component is the information decay parameter. So this just represents the idea that when you disengage from something, unless it's a YouTube video or something, you lose information about it. So just because you have disengaged from looking at some animals at the zoo doesn't mean they stop and they wait for you to look again. You lose information as a function of disengaging. And this is represented by power law decay. Okay, and this is the decision-making process. So first, the ideal learner computes the expected information gained from each object in this little toy world, and then makes a decision about whether to maintain attention or to switch on the basis of where the ideal learner expects there will be the most learning progress. And what you get out from this are some very interesting dynamics. So I'll talk you through this plot. At time point 1, the ideal learner doesn't know anything about any of these objects in this little toy world, so it doesn't matter what the learner chooses. The learner picks the yellow thing, conveniently labeled object 1 here, and starts learning everything about that object. But once the learner hits the diminishing return part of the curve, it now would make sense for them to cut their losses and move to something else, so that's what they do. Object 2, the green one, is picked up, and learning starts of that one starts ramping up. And then as the learner approaches the diminishing return part of that curve, they do something interesting, which was not obvious to us until we actually did this out. They switch back and forth between object 1 and object 2. They've lost some information about object 1 because of the power law decay. So it now makes sense. Your best strategy for maximizing information is switching back and forth between object 1 and object 2. You repeat that for a third object and a fourth object. There is a fifth object that never gets picked up. At some point, depending upon the particular setting for the information decay parameter, your best strategy is to spend all of your time juggling what you already know. You don't pick up stuff forever. Instead, you should maintain existing representations. That's the best strategy. One of the important implications that I think comes out of this work is that context matters. Both external context, which is something people like George Alvarez and Ed Vol have said before, the way that you split your attention between sloths, for example, is not the same way that you should split your attention between an animal like a gazelle. Depending upon the speed at which the gazelle is moving, or the animal is moving, the slower things move, the more things you can maintain. That's like the more things you are able to pick up and then juggle. Likewise, internal context also matters. So variability, not just in the external factors like the world, but also things like core cognitive capabilities also matter. The number of objects you can handle if you learn quickly or remember better is greater than the number that you can handle if you process things slowly or you forget easily. Okay, number 3, it's what you think you know that determines your curiosity, not what you actually know. I think this is a point that is easy to miss. They are not the same thing. The evidence that we have for this comes from a study that was recently published, written by Shirley Wade and I in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review. And in this work, we used a classic trivia question paradigm to test this idea. We asked people trivia questions like this one: what's the 9th most poisonous animal in the world? And then we had them guess, but we also asked them how close they thought that they were to the right answer. In addition to those 2 measurements, we got an objective measure of how close they actually were. So maybe if the answer is dart frog, as some kind of snake, is closer than if you guess something like a flamingo. And what we were interested in is what predicts the learning, what predicts curiosity. Both the metacognitive estimate and the objective truth end up contributing, but it's the metacognitive estimate, it's how close you think you are, that's determining your curiosity. This changes basic ideas like how we approach things that Maria Montessori said about readiness. The implication is that it's not enough for the child to possess the right conceptual foundations to learn a brand new concept. They have to know that what they don't know to get that brand new concept. They have to be able to estimate the value gained by learning it in order to be curious and in order to have the motivation that's required to devote attention and then learn it. Okay, 4. I'm doing okay on time. Learners' confidence is driven by feedback, not the ground truth. This work was done by Louis Marti and Frank Malika, both of whom are here right now. I just mentioned that when we get curious when we are consciously uncertain. So the next question we were interested in is how well our certainty is calibrated to how certain we should be given the ground truth of the matter or the objective truth. Through this work, what we've learned is that certainty isn't well calibrated to how certain we should be, given the evidence. Instead, people are pushed around in terms of how certain they feel based on whether or not they're getting stuff right. Even in a context where they should know that these are just a few lucky guesses. If you get a few lucky guesses, you get a few pieces of feedback that you're correct, you feel very certain. And the problem with that is we know that if you feel very certain, your curiosity plummets and you might get stuck there. You have a crazy idea, you generate a few predictions. If those happen to be right, the risk is that you can get stuck in a place where you're very confident about the answer, you're not curious about integrating new information, and you never get to correct that misconception. We've also looked at this more recently in a poster that Lewis just gave today about the cases where feedback is sparse. So we've been looking about people's concepts for words. When two people use the same word, are they activating the same concept? The answer in a nutshell is no. Second question, are they aware that they are not activating the same concept when they're talking to other people? And the answer to that also is they're not, they don't tend to be as aware as they should be. In general, they overestimate their judgment about how close their idea of the concept is to someone else's. And this is what Lewis looks like, so you can find him and see his poster and talk more about this work at CogSci. Okay, so this is the exciting part. I was like, 4 things that I think that we don't know, but we should. And if these are things that you're interested in, these are things that we think about a lot. My lab is new at Berkeley. We're looking for people. So if you're very intrigued and you can program, you should talk to me about postdocs or grad positions. The first thing is, does curiosity change across the lifespan? There's a common belief that children are more curious than adults. I answer this question a lot when I'm talking to both families and also doing science communication things. And I understand why people have that belief. Liz made reference to this maybe not being quite right. A lot of the reasons that people believe that are based on just sort of a sense that kids will explore anything, whereas college students or something are maybe more picky. But hopefully I've convinced you that your curiosity relates to your previous knowledge, and there's another big difference between infants and college students, which is infants know very little about the world. If you are an infant, you know very little about the world. It could be that sort of anything is equally great, a piece of tape, a circus, a bear, it doesn't matter. If I don't know anything is fine. It could be that adults are not less curious, as in they have less drive than infants. Instead, it could be that their interests are somewhat peakier. I see a lot of evidence of curiosity in my own students in the lab. I was like, all of us spend a lot of time pursuing very niche knowledge in this room as scientists. We pay more money to get episodes of things that we're curious how they'll come out sooner. Curiosity is all around us, and I don't see that same thing about, I was like, I don't see adults as being less curious inherently. So this is an open question that I think is also underappreciated. Number 2, are learners' overestimates of their own knowledge functional and adaptive? When Lewis and I first started talking, you come in with sort of a belief that people should be well calibrated to what is true in the world. But if you think about it a little bit more, we know that people generally overestimate their knowledge. And we also know that people are most curious when they think they are close to getting the right answer. If you combine those things, that miscalibration in many cases may actually be functional. It may be a feature instead of a bug. If you constantly think you're on the verge of knowing, you may be motivated to keep going. You sort of want your curiosity, your competence to be incrementally revealed to be false. So it's like if you were fully aware at the very beginning that you start something of exactly how much you don't know, I was like, it may be demotivating. You don't pursue it at all. So it's possible that this particular feature, this particular miscalibration is actually good based on how our system works. Number 3, can you use feedback to reinduce curiosity in the face of unjustified certainty? If somebody has the wrong belief about how the world works, we would like to be able to reinduce it when that person's belief doesn't match reality. I'm sure everybody has had dinner with their families and had an experience with this hope, this desire. This is something that we totally don't know. It's something that we're planning on trying to do. We recently got a grant from the New Media Center at Berkeley, and we're looking in particular at flat earthers, but we don't know. So can you reinvigorate curiosity when people are already very certain? And the fourth and final thing, what explains the variance in learners' curiosity? I said we don't know as much as people think that we know about how Curiosity varies across individuals and across the lifespan. A lot of the tools that we have for measuring it, the data that people are using to make that claim, come from clinical tools that are asking things like, does it sound interesting to build a birdhouse? Does it sound interesting to learn how to play baseball? They're measuring mostly the breadth of your interests, which is not the same thing as the intensity of the drive. But anything in people that might vary probably does. We have developed some quantitative techniques for using relatively naturalistic tasks. Kids playing this Toca Boca touchscreen game in order to explore monsters and their food preferences. This game is called Toca Boca Monsters. It's like you can select a monster and then select different foods and then feed them different foods that have been prepared in different ways, and this changes their preferences. So there's no inherent goal to it, rather just to explore the space. We take their patterns of exploration and do a kind of modified zip analysis, like when you zip a file, the more redundancy that's in the file, the smaller the file compresses. As we're able to look at how much redundancy there is in kids' play patterns versus how broad their exploration of the different options are. And when we do that, we do get a trend that many people predicted. Kids become more routine, less wildly exploratory as they mature. But if you look there, it's not really strongly well predicted by age. There's a lot of other variance that's left unaccounted for, and we don't know where that's coming from. Hopefully I've convinced you that worrying about not just the external context and how that varies, but also the internal context about how you process and how you forget is really important to solving this individual differences question. With that, I'd like to thank the 3 graduate students that were first authors on this work and my other collaborators. Thank you also to the Jacobs Foundation for funding a lot of this work and for sponsoring this symposium, and the CogSci organizers for bringing me together with some of my good friends who also were funded through the Jacobs Foundation as part of the same early scientist fellowship. And Todd for moderating and letting me know that I'm on time. Thanks.
Okay, so we alternated height. All right, so you might think that I paid Celeste lots and lots of money to have her very last question be the one that I'm trying to answer, but you would be wrong. We are nowhere near that well prepared, but it's exactly what we're going after here. So I'm interested in how kids' context, how their experiences shape their brains and their curiosity, right? Exactly in these individual differences that Celeste is seeing in her research. Curiosity is brand new for me. This is brand new data. This is the first time I'm showing it to an audience of scientists. I showed a bunch of educators a couple weeks ago, and they just thought brains were cool, which is basically what I think too. And I'm really excited to get your feedback on this new data. So more broadly in my lab, we're interested in the kinds of cognitive skills that we need to do well in school. We're interested in how changes in the brain support these cognitive skills and how kids' specific experiences shape the brain. A lot of the data that I'll be showing you today is correlational, but what we're really excited about are the deltas, how changing a kid's experiences change their brains and change their cognitive skills. So ultimately, we'll be going at this question of change through causal models in animals, through collaborations, which I'll mention with Kate Pena, but also with educational interventions and some longitudinal data that we're excited to have come in. So we came to the question of curiosity through a few different ways. We saw a paper a year ago showing that a single question to parents about their kids' curiosity was predictive of their reading and math when they entered kindergarten, as predictive as their effortful control, and that curiosity question was even more predictive for kids coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I think also we're excited about curiosity because it's been linked to processes at the cellular level, as Tobias mentioned. So if we zoom into the brain and think about just 2 cells, as these cells communicate, their connections get stronger. We see the formation of synapses, right? So cells that fire together, wire together, and as this information stream is sort of reactivated over and over again, it gets glued into place by myelin. This is a developmental process that makes adults less plastic, less able to learn in general than children. However, in the presence of dopamine, From the ventral tegmental area, what we see, particularly in animal models, is the reawakening of plasticity. Right? So where there's dopamine, there's plasticity. And dopamine doesn't just hit the whole brain at once. There's really selective projections from the VTA into the medial wall of prefrontal cortex. And this is also where you see the most dopamine receptors. The VTA function is impacted by experiences, particularly by stress. In mice, gene changes in the VTA specifically, can cause changes in social exploration. Right? You can turn these genes off and on and recapitulate the effects of early life stress. And also in other lines of work, we see that in animal models, stress will reduce exploration of open fields and of novel toys. So this is telling us both that stress is changing, VTA changing the dopamine innervation of the rest of the brain, leading potentially to reduced exploration. This finding made us curious about what was going on in kids. Just making sure you're paying attention. So my graduate student, Ann Park, looked at functional connectivity. So this is where we're looking at correlations in the blood oxygen time course. And what's nice is these correlations map onto anatomy. Stronger correlations, more anatomically connected. And she looked at the VTA as correlated with the rest of the brain. And she found that individuals with higher early life stress experiences had weaker connectivity from VTA to MPFC. Right, so those neurons from VTA are not making it up to MPFC. That's what we see in animal models, and there's weaker connectivity there. MPFC in general is associated with attention, cognitive control. Right, so what weak connectivity here we thought might be sort of influential for many different kinds of cognitive processes. But then my graduate student, Ursula Tooley, started telling us about the curiosity literature. And in the curiosity literature, there's this seminal study by Gruber and colleagues where they asked a bunch of adults a series of questions, like, what does the term dinosaur actually mean? And then they had them rate their curiosity. Right? So as Celeste mentioned, adults can be kind of picky. I'm not especially interested in dinosaurs. Celeste seemed to be really interested in poisonous animals. Tobias is really into beer. I think Liz is really interested in Cicero. But if I had to pick, I'm hanging out with Tobias later. I know he knows where all the best beer is. Anyway, so now Gruber and colleagues are going to look in 2 reward areas to see whether these areas track with curiosity. And what they found was exactly that. 4 questions that people were more curious about, they found more activation in the nucleus accumbens and in the ventral tegmental area. But then when they expanded the search, not just to these regions, but to the whole brain, they found 2 additional areas, MPFC and cerebellum. So all of these data taken together made us really interested in whether early life stress was impacting this VTA to MPFC connectivity, okay, and whether that impaired or impacted curiosity. And so we can sort of put this another way. Let's look at correlations between stress, VTA connectivity, and curiosity. We're going for naturalistic measures of curiosity here, and I'll tell you a little bit in a minute about how we do that. So we're looking at question asking and parent report. And for VTA connectivity, we're again taking advantage of resting state fMRI. We're using a VTA seed that's defined in an atlas based on postmortem brains, and kicking out any kids with too much motion, which unfortunately in this age range is sort of a lot of kids. And then we have measures of the bad things that happen to kids and how stressed out parents feel on a day-to-day basis, thinking that that's going to sort of transfer to how kids are feeling day-to-day as well. I want to take a minute to tell you about our sample. So we work in Philadelphia. We're recruiting kids between the ages of 4 and 8. We have data on 45 kids who've done the question-asking task, 104 with questionnaires. Our hit rate on imaging is about 60% of that. Our racial makeup matches our city pretty well, as does ethnicity. We have about 42% of families where the parent has a high school degree or less, which is very similar to Philadelphia as a whole city. And our income distribution also looks like the city, which is the largest, or the poorest large city in the country. I mention this because there's work by Kaya Lewin showing that in general, neuroimaging studies vastly underrepresent families from lower income backgrounds. So here we're actually getting a sample that is more representative of our city, but might be a sample that looks somewhat different to some of the samples that you've seen in the literature. Okay, so let me tell you about our behavioral measures. We're looking at how kids ask questions, and they're going to do 3 tasks. This is based on Clancy Blair's 3 bags task. In the first task, they look at a wordless picture book in which an alien spaceship lands on Earth only to encounter a ferocious cat. And it is very cute and very funny, and the kids have lots of questions about this book. There are no words, and so we don't sort of get into this pattern of the adult just reading. The kids are really driving the show here. We then have them do a difficult puzzle, and then they play with a set of novel toys. I think we have a glow-in-the-dark bracelet, a wooden top, and something that's like rainbow cubes that I still don't know what it is, but is super fun. Okay, so we have them engage in these activities, and we just count how many questions kids ask. We also have parents report on their kids' curiosity. So we use a validated questionnaire in this age range. We have items that are about interest type epistemic curiosity, so items like, my child has fun learning about new topics or subjects, and questions that are more about the deprivation type curiosity. My child devotes considerable effort to trying to figure out things that are confusing or unclear. These 2 types of items correlate quite well together, a correlation of about 0.6. The questionnaires in general only weakly correlate with what we actually see with the question asking. So we're going to look at those 2 curiosity measures separately. So now let's turn to the brain data. And we're going to ask, how does VTA-MPFC connectivity relate to question asking? Again, taking advantage of these correlations in bold or blood oxygen. And so what we're going to focus on is this VTA to MPFC link using the area that Gruber found. So using the area that we found to be associated with curiosity in adults and linking it to how many questions kids ask. And what we see is a really nice positive relationship here. So the stronger this connectivity between the dopaminergic VTA and attention areas in MPFC, the more questions kids are asking. And then we can expand our search. So not just this targeted ROI approach, but looking at the whole brain. And one feature of this is it's nice to look at VTA connectivity and make sure that it's mapping onto anatomy. And what we see are the connections that we would expect to the medial wall of prefrontal cortex, but also into the hippocampus, the striatum, and into the cerebellum. And there are direct monosynaptic projections from the cerebellum back to VTA. With functional connectivity, you can't tell the directionality of these connections. So now, when we go back to this individual differences question, what we see is that VTA connectivity with this area of MPFC, the one that was actually really close to what they saw in adults, right, is associated with more question asking, as well as an area in lateral PFC. And so our whole brain approach is confirming what we're seeing with that targeted ROI analysis. We can now also take the whole brain approach to looking at parent report of curiosity. And here we see connectivity with the cerebellum, which at first I was a little bit surprised by. And I was talking to Kate Pena, who works in animal models, and she shot off an email to Sam Wong at Princeton, and in about 4 minutes, maybe less, he sent me 6 papers on exactly this projection, including a new paper in Science that came out earlier this year, showing that optogenetic activation of the cerebellum to VTA projection was necessary for social exploration. Right? So we have this anatomy in animal models that's giving us some confidence about our finding in humans, that stronger cerebellum to VTA connectivity is associated with more curiosity. Okay, so basically what we're seeing here is that greater VTA to MPFC connectivity is more correlated with question asking, and greater VTA to cerebellum connectivity is more associated with parent report of curiosity. We can now look to stress. We have sort of a smaller sample here. We're not seeing super strong relationships between stress and VTA connectivity in this sample, but we are seeing our expected relationships with curiosity. So we see, if we look, sort of zoom out and look at socioeconomic status, with income sort of being related to stress, we see that kids from higher income backgrounds ask more questions. But even when we control for that, along with all of these other demographics, age and race, we still see that families where the parents feeling more stressed, the kids are asking fewer questions, right? So we have some hint here that stress is a problem for curiosity in these kids. And I don't want to leave you on a negative note, that we only can explain variance in curiosity by thinking about the bad things that happen to kids. We also have to think about kids practicing being curious. When they practice being curious more, do you see that strengthening? Do you see that their cells are firing together and wiring together in this mesocortical limbic curiosity network? And what we see is that children who engage in more play are more curious, again, by parent report. And we see that that's especially true for play that has to do with art, spatial play, and pretend play. Right? And so, of course, these are just correlations, but I think that that gives us some traction into how we might make kids' lives better, right? And how we might boost their curiosity. We can't go around and change kids' stress experiences, but we absolutely can provide better toys, more toys, help teach parents and teachers how to play in a way that cultivates their curiosity. So what I showed you today is that we see that curiosity is associated with the connectivity between dopamine motivation regions and attention areas in MPFC. We also have the surprising finding of a link between VTA and cerebellum for curiosity that actually maps to these causal manipulations in animal models. We found in one data set that stress is associated with reduced MPFC to VTA connectivity. Okay? And we see that stress is associated with less question asking, less curiosity. But we also see that parent reports of curiosity and play are positively correlated, giving us some hope that we can actually change kids' lives for the better. Thank you.